Well, hi there, and welcome to Implementation Lab for the month of October. My name is Todd Rhodes with Leadership Network, and really excited to have you with us today. We've got Chris Surratt, who's going to be, we're going to be talking about the topic of small groups. Some churches call them home groups, life groups, whatever you call them in your church. We're going to talk today about 4 reasons why your small groups aren't working. And Chris Surratt is going to join us in just a moment. But just a couple of announcements before we get started. Of course, don't forget next week at this time, next Tuesday at this time at 1 Eastern, we're going to have office hours, so you can call in and actually give us your questions. And you can also email any questions that you have specifically about the topic of small groups. You can send us an email at lab@leadnet.org. lab@leadnet.org, and we'll make sure that we try and answer as many of your questions as we can next week on office hours. And we'll watch your inbox, we'll send you an email that will have the link to that as well. Also, just so you know, if you've not weren't able to catch last month, we added a brand new partner, the Made to Flourish, is now doing some content with us each month. And last month they had a really great lab session with David Kinnaman from Barna. If you haven't seen that, just log into your lab account and you can watch that on demand right there from your lab account. Also, as we get started today, if you haven't already done so, hopefully you make this your practice each month on the lab. Take a moment and download your execution plan template. You can do that right here on this page, and as you do that, that will help you. Really, we want to move you from idea to implementation to impact and give you a plan, and that template will help you to do that in the next 30 days, some steps that you can take from what you learned today to actually implement your plan of small groups in your church. So all that to say, I want to introduce our guest presenter for today. Our faculty member this month is Chris Surratt. And Chris, good to have you with us. Chris is a ministry consultant. How's this to make you feel old, Chris? You've been in ministry for almost a quarter of a century. You're getting
I know,
old, man.
It's crazy. Yeah, I started when I was 10. So
there you go. I've got a few years on you too, and it's like, yeah, I started when I was like -4, but yeah, I hear you. But Chris has served some great churches. He served at Seacoast. He served at Cross Point in Nashville. He now works with Lifeway Christian Resources as their discipleship and small group specialist. And he's even written the definitive book, I think. It's the definitive book on small groups in the church called Small Groups for the Rest of Us. And we'll maybe talk about that maybe a little bit at the end of today's lab session. But Chris, excited to have you share with us. Thanks so much for being here. We look forward to what you've got to tell us.
Man, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks, Todd, for the invite, and can't wait to share some thoughts with everybody who's watching this lab. Been looking forward to this for several months. My job is I talk about small groups a lot and visit a lot of churches and write a blog, and I've written a couple of books on small groups. And I want to specifically talk today about why small groups may not be working at your church. Now, they may be working beautifully, and that's amazing, but you could maybe be in the minority on that, because I talk to a lot of churches that are just struggling with getting people into small groups, getting people in their church to buy into the idea of attending small groups. And as I look at it and write about it and talk about it, there are a myriad of reasons why that happens. But as I talk to small group pastors and small group point people, there tends to be 4 main reasons that just pop up over and over that I see that small groups are not working at their church. And so I want to run through those 4, and this is just kind of a surface talk. You can find out more in my book or during office hours, but I'm going to hit some of the main points. The first one is kind of the biggest one, and really nothing else is going to work if this doesn't happen. But the first reason why small groups may not be working in your church is the senior pastor doesn't believe in them. It really starts with the senior pastor when it comes to anything at the church. I mean, any ministry that you want to function and to be healthy, the senior pastor has to buy into them, but especially when it comes to discipleship and small groups. You know, the congregation will only go where the leader is willing to go before them. And so if the senior pastor is not the champion for groups, your people are probably not going to follow into small groups. I got this statistic a while back, and it's kind of a ballpark. It's not scientific, but from what I've seen, when the senior pastor is not supporting groups, but they have groups, but they're not really supporting them, but they exist, you can get about 20% of the people in your church to join groups, about 20%. And that's kind of your core. If you're familiar kind of with the Rick Warren concentric circles, and you've got your core and you've got your community and crowd. Well, the core will do almost anything that you ask them to do. They're your volunteers. They're kind of the leaders in your church, and they're going to be the ones that will jump into a small group, even if the pastor doesn't really support the group. So you can get about 20%. And then if the pastor gives some support, maybe he talks about groups occasionally, maybe do a big push once or twice a year and supports them, you could probably get about 40 to 50% of your church to join small groups. And you're going to cap out at about 50% with that much support from the senior pastor. But if the senior pastor will give full support, I've seen you can get about 60 to 70% of your people that will join small groups. And in my work with consulting, we found that most healthy churches with small groups run about 60% in their groups, and that's amazing. And so if your senior pastor is fully support, is a champion of groups, is talking about groups, then you can probably get up to 70%. And then if you want to go even beyond that, you can get up 90%, 100% if your pastor is fully supportive and you're doing some sort of an all-church campaign where everyone is studying the same thing, talking about it in the message on Sunday, and then following up in the small groups. You can get 90 to 100%. When I was at Crosspoint, we would get about 93, 94% during our campaigns. Saddleback is a good model for this. If you look at their church, Rick Warren talks about groups, believes in groups. They run campaigns for groups, and they say they have over 100% of the people in their church. So they're inviting their neighbors, they're inviting people outside of the church into small groups. So that is possible. Now, what I say a lot of times too is that the senior pastor doesn't have to lead a small group. In fact, I find that most senior pastors, this is no offense, teaching pastors, and can I say this word, Todd, suck at leading a small group. Maybe that may not be. Okay. All right. Just want to make sure Ellen hasn't changed too much. All right. So, I mean, they're just not good group leaders, because whenever I coach a group leader, I always say only talk about 30 to 35% of the time. So when you're asking a question, let it breathe. Somebody's going to jump in and answer it because they haven't heard the question yet. But that's almost impossible for a teaching pastor, senior pastor. They love to talk. That's why they do what they do, is because they love to talk. And so it's hard for them to do that. So they don't necessarily need to lead a group, but they should be in a group, and probably a group that they have chosen. So give them the opportunity to be in a group with people they've chosen. And it might not even be people in the church, because if we truly want everybody in our church to be doing life together, to be able to kind of really let go of everything when they're in their group, then it might need to be somebody or people that are outside of the church. So that's okay. But if they're in a group, they're talking about their group, they're using examples from the group, then people will get excited about groups. And so if your senior pastor is not on board, not too excited about groups, let me give you 4 quick things that you might try to get them on board. One is bring them stories of life change. So if you have some groups going, and maybe you're testing groups, or you've had some groups going for a while, I guarantee there's some life change happening, and there's some people taking their next spiritual steps. So look for those stories, bring them to your pastor. They're going to love to have it, because they need examples, they need illustrations for their messages. They're making things up at this point, so they need stuff for their messages. So bring them those stories of life change, and they'll get excited about what's going on when that happens. Number two, involve them in any kind of training or leadership rally opportunities that you have. So if you get your group leaders together, once or twice a year, and you have some sort of a training, a rally, invite your senior pastor to be a part of that. Let them kick it off. Talk about their heart for discipleship, or maybe wrap it up at the end, but allow them to kind of be a part of that, to feel the excitement for it. And they'll get excited about it when they see a bunch of leaders coming together and kind of rallying around a ministry of the church. Number three, show them how key initiatives can be reinforced through groups, like a giving campaign. If you're about to go through a giving campaign for a building or a ministry initiative or missions or anything like that, you can build curriculum around it and offer it to your groups and reinforce the message from Sunday through the groups, and show the pastor how that can be done and how it's even more effective when groups are talking about it during the week. So do those key initiatives, build them through the groups. And then number four is what I already mentioned, but allow them to have it handpicked small group. So again, be in a group, handpick those group members, and that'll be an easier way to ease your senior leader into a small group. But that's so key. That's number one. Always start with that, is the senior pastor really needs to be the champion of small groups. That doesn't mean they run the small groups or they're the administrative piece for small groups. You're going to still need somebody that does that, either on staff or a key volunteer, but they're truly the onstage public champion for groups. All right, so that's number one. Number two is that small groups may just be another program at your church. Groups, when they're on a long menu of ministry opportunities, they're going to lose almost every single time. I kind of compare this to restaurants. I love food, so I talk about it a lot. But two of my favorite restaurants are the In-N-Out Burger, which I only get when I'm on the West Coast or I'm in Dallas, but we don't have them out here in Nashville, Tennessee, but In-N-Out Burger. And then another favorite is the Cheesecake Factory. Now, when I go to the In-N-Out Burger, and if you've ever been, you know this, you look at their menu and there's basically four options. There's four things you can pick from on the menu. So it's super simple. You don't spend a lot of time making a decision. Now, there's a secret menu that I like. There's only a couple items on that, but there's basically four main choices. It's really easy. Don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. Now, on the flip side is another restaurant I love, the Cheesecake Factory. Now, if you go to a Cheesecake Factory, really good food. Don't look at the calories online, trust me on that, but really good food. But they've got like a novel for their menu. I mean, seriously, you're flipping through and it's really tough to decide which one because it all looks good. And every time I go, the waiter will come over, after a few minutes, say, "Are you ready to order?" I'm like, "Give me till Tuesday. This is really tough." There's that decision paralysis that is scientific that people have when there's too many choices. And that's what happens when we make small groups just another choice on the menu. And they're going to drop to the bottom because they're more difficult. There's more accountability when it comes to being in a small group. It's harder to go to a stranger's house or somebody else's house than it is to go to a Monday night singles ministry or a Tuesday night prayer meeting or whatever it is. It's much easier to go to those big group opportunities than to go into a small group of people who are going to be keeping myself accountable, walking life together with me. That's just harder. Now, what people need is a clear and easy discipleship path to follow. So, a lot of times when I talk about this, pastors or staff will say, "Well, we need to cut men's ministry. We need to cut women's ministry. We need to cut Awana." I'm like, no, that's not really what it's about. It's about making an easy path for people to follow. So with that path, decide what ministries or programs are leading to life change. So kind of build in that matrix of, okay, we've got these ministries. What are they doing? What are they truly doing? Are they leading to life change? And if groups are a part of that, if groups are kind of your in and out or your iPhone, home button, for people to get involved, to get discipled and all of that, you want to make it easy and obvious on that path for people to get into groups. So that may mean you need to, kind of move a couple ministries around, or maybe take a men's ministry and make them men's groups instead, or same thing with women's ministry, make them women's groups instead. But whatever it is, make groups an easy and obvious choice on your discipleship path for people to follow. Now, as you do that, you want to make sure that your groups are as strong as they can be, because people will give you probably one or two chances, opportunities to be a part of a group. And if they're not healthy, if they're not good, they're not going to do it again. So as you think about your groups on your path, make sure that you build a sustainable, reproducible system. So can these groups sustain? Can you reproduce them? So as you add, maybe campuses, or you add people as your church grows, can you add more groups? Are they reproducible? And then are they going to last more than just 6 weeks? If you're doing a campaign, that's great. But if you're building groups just for that campaign, then they're going to die, they're going to fade out, and people are not going to try them again. So are they sustainable? Can they last beyond those initial 6 weeks? Also, budget for them. Put it into the budget. They're going to need good curriculum. Not just making up things to talk about. They're going to need some curriculum. They're going to need training. Put some money behind that, whether it's taking your leaders to a conference, or getting them material or books to read, or building videos, or whatever that is. Put them into the budget. A lot of times groups get forgotten and they don't land anywhere on the budget, and it's going to be hard for them to be sustained and reproducible if you're not putting them in the budget. And then market them. Get creative with it. We did one time at Crosspoint, we did an Instagram marketing campaign where we shot all these videos. We talked about how groups, we're not asking them to get married, so it's not a lifelong commitment. Don't get afraid. All of these, just get creative with them and market them like you would anything else in your church, and put them on social media, put them on Facebook, bring those stories, those videos of life change, put them out there so people know what's going on in groups. And then another one is put them on your website. Make sure that people can get to them during the week. Because nowadays, if they're not on the website, or if they're not on your phone, they don't exist. So make them easy to get to, put them on your website. Let people have kind of that time to decide what kind of group they want to be a part of by checking them out on your website. All right, so that's number 2. Don't make them a part of a long menu. Make them easy and obvious. And then number 3, maybe there's no easy on-ramps to groups. No easy on-ramps to getting into groups. So let me ask this. How hard is it at your church, if I was to come and be a part of your church, how hard is it for me to join a group or even start a group? Or if I join your group, how long can I lead a group? How long is that going to take me? How many hurdles, how many bars are there before I can lead a group? And that's going to decide how effective your groups are, and how you can multiply, and how quick you can multiply your groups. You can set the leadership bar high, and you're going to have probably high quality groups. I talked to one church not that long ago where their groups could only be led by elders. Now that's going to shrink the number of groups that you can have and how many people can be in groups, but I bet they're really quality groups, are really good. Or you can set the bar lower and you can have high quantity of groups. So you can have high quality groups, you can have high quantity groups. Where on that bar are you comfortable setting it? Because if you're going to want to reproduce groups, if you're going to want to multiply groups, if you're going to want people to get into leadership, you're going to need to decide how many hoops and how high the bar needs to be set for people to be able to lead, to start a group at your church. Now, I'm not saying you stomp on the bar. There probably should be some type of a bar. There should be something that people need to go through so they understand who you are as a church, kind of understand what you believe in, what groups are in. But how long does that take? Is that a 6-week class? Is that 2 hours on a Saturday? What does that look like? Because that's going to decide how many people can lead a group and how fast you can start a groups. And then again, on your website, how many clicks does it take for me to get to your small groups? I've gone to a lot of church websites looking for their groups, and it's like 3 or 4 clicks before I can even find them. And by that time, I'm done. I'm giving up. So if you really want to make it easy and obvious, make it a 1-click. Is it somewhere on the front of your website? You want people, as they come to your website, to see the most important things to your church. And if groups are going to be important, put them on the front page of the website somewhere. some kind of access to groups. And then again, do you align your church maybe at least once a year around a campaign or a series or something like that, because that helps people get into groups, makes it easy to start groups. One time at Crosspoint, we started a campaign. We were able to start like 250 groups at one time that we never would have been able to do if we hadn't done a campaign. Some of the benefits of an all-church campaign is it gets your groups all on the same page. So they're all talking about the same thing for at least 5 or 6 weeks, where the rest of the time they may be doing other studies, but it gets them talking about the same thing, same language. Also, it connects people to the vision of the church. I love campaigns that are kind of built on who we are. What is our DNA as a church? And then just reinforces that through the groups, through your leaders. Then also it offers an easy entry point to small groups. That's an exciting thing to talk about. Hey, in 3 weeks, we're starting this series. We're going to be talking about it all week in groups. You're going to miss out if you're not in a group. So this is a great time to get involved. We're going to make it easy. We're going to put it on the website. We're going to have a connection event, whatever that is, but that's just an easy on-ramp for people to get into groups. And then also, if you shoot videos of your pastor, teaching pastors, maybe like an 8 to 10 minute cutting room material, because there's always more that they never get in the message, shoot that, and that gets your pastor into the living rooms of the people in your church. And that's just a great way to introduce them to the heart of the pastor. All right, so that's number 3. There's no easy on-ramps to groups. We want to make sure that we can get people into groups as fast as we can, get groups started as fast as we can. And then number 4 is maybe no one on staff is waking up in the morning thinking about groups. Now again, the pastor or senior pastor should be the champion of groups, but you still need somebody either on staff or a key volunteer that really believes in groups, is kind of working behind the scenes, building the systems, getting leaders trained, doing all of that. But you need somebody who just does that. Small groups often end up as a subset on a job description. It's the student pastor who also takes care of the single moms, who also takes care of the janitorial staff, and takes care of small groups as well. So a lot of times it ends up as a subset, and it doesn't get the attention that it needs. If it's going to be a key part of your discipleship path, if it's going to be the way that people, get into community, get discipled, disciple others, then you want to make it somebody's responsibility. It's somebody's job to do that. Now, this can be a volunteer at first. It doesn't have to be somebody on staff. When I was at Crosspoint, we had multiple campuses. When we would start a campus, that small groups person usually started out as a volunteer. It was a key volunteer, somebody who had capacity to be able to kind of oversee groups and oversee that ministry. In fact, we had somebody at one of our campuses who was a key volunteer, even up to about 50 or 60 groups. Now that's not ideal, but they had the capacity. They were able to do it, but it can be done. So it doesn't have to be somebody on staff first, but start thinking about that. When we have the budget, when we're able to do that, let's add that position because it's key for us. Budget for groups. Feed what you want to grow. So if you want your groups to grow, start thinking about that staff person, start thinking about that future budget for your groups. And it needs to be somebody who's passionate about groups, not necessarily a stepping stone to another place in ministry, another position. I did a consultation one time for a church, and I was talking to the groups person, and I was talking just about, bet you love groups, love discipleship. And they were like, yeah, it's okay. I'm really kind of waiting until I can get this position. When this one comes open, that's really my passion. And I thought, well, they're never going to succeed. Again, people will follow where the leader is going. And if the leader of groups doesn't believe in them, isn't passionate, then it's not going to happen. And then resource that person with training and opportunities to network with other churches. I do something at Lifeway called Small Group Essentials, where we bring in like 25 groups people, and they just spend 2 days with each other, and we make it free, so it's really easy. But just look for opportunities like that where they can learn from each other and get better. All right, so that's 4 things. There are a lot of other things, but make sure your senior pastor is the champion, that small groups are not just another program on the menu, that there's easy on-ramps to get into groups, and then somebody on staff or a key volunteer is thinking about groups every single day.
Very good. Thanks so much, Chris. I mean, lots of, I appreciate the 4 points, but you had so many different subpoints and things we could talk about probably for hours here, but we won't. I won't keep you that long, but let's go to a little bit of Q&A with some questions. I guess my first question is, I think I've seen, and maybe you can back up my hypothesis here. It seems like maybe 10 years ago, a lot of churches seemed to be more programmed. It was kind of it was for sure the Cheesecake Factory kind of menu of ministries.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen, it seems like kind of a trend for churches, and it takes time and it's painful when you have to go from the Cheesecake Factory menu to the In-N-Out menu. But how do you, if you're on staff at a Cheesecake Factory church and you want to get to the In-N-Out menu church, going from, we've got 18 ministries for women and mothers and expected mothers and mothers of teenagers and empty nesters, down to where you can get that kind of clear path so that you're not competing. Because what I heard you say is that when you've got that big menu, it's really hard to get people into small groups because there's so many different choices for them that they can do.
Yeah, and it's hard. I'm not saying it's easy. It's a lot easier to start a new church and start simple. But what we've discovered, I work with a consulting group, and we've worked with hundreds of churches now. And what we found is the churches that are stagnant or shrinking or really stuck tend to have more programs than the churches that are growing. They're over-programmed. And that's a lot of the reason why they're stuck. Now, getting from that to, the kind of simple church model is not easy. And I think sometimes it's misunderstood. I talked to some pastors and they've read Simple Church. If you've read Simple Church by Eric Geiger,
Sure.
That was a great book, a seminal book on kind of decluttering your programs and what they were about is what I talked about, making a simple path for people to follow. Now, some of these ministries might really fit on that path, but it doesn't mean you're going to cut everything. So, like I said, don't cut Awana tomorrow. In some of these ministries need a proper burial. Maybe they've been dying or shrinking for a long time, and sometimes we can just cut them and say we don't need them anymore. And there's people who believe in those ministries, and maybe they started those ministries, and in 1998 it was important. It was a part of the church, but maybe it's not anymore. But they need a proper burial. They need a time to grieve and to redirect behind the vision of where we're going with the simple path. So yeah, it's not easy, and I wouldn't recommend just going, okay, we need 4 things, we're cutting everything else. But it's worth it to sit down with the leadership of the church, kind of walk through a matrix. We use a matrix where you kind of have 4 quadrants, and on one side of it, it's you're kind of measuring whether it's high life change or low life change. So, and then the other one is high investment, low investment. And you kind of run it through that quadrant, and you decide which ministries are bringing life change and which ministries are requiring a lot of investment, but they're not really bringing any fruit anymore. Maybe they did at one time, and we need to start kind of easing those out in favor of this kind of more simple, easier path that involves groups or whatever ministries are functioning well for you. So it's going through that process. Don't do it overnight. It's going to take time, but I am seeing a trend of churches that are kind of following that simple path for discipleship.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Chris, one of the other things I've kind of noticed, and maybe I'm not right here, but I think this is a trend I'm seeing, is that more and more churches, and this kind of happens over time, is that some of the larger churches will start with a staff position kind of in a specific area. So maybe 5 or 10 years ago, we saw a lot of larger churches that were pouring a lot of resources and staff dollars into a small groups pastor, which up until that point, maybe it was just called something different, but all that's kind of starting to trickle down a little bit. So now we've got not just large churches that are hiring small groups pastors, but smaller churches um, that are hiring. Well, we've got a worship guy, we got a youth guy. We need to hire a small groups guy or gal. So they hire a small groups gal, but they don't really consider the cost of kind of all those silos and ministry plans. So I want to ask you a couple questions that have to do with, because we've got small group pastors that are watching us right now that maybe are saying what you just said and they're frustrated. I mean, they're maybe more frustrated now than when they started 20 minutes ago. In that, okay, so I'm the small groups pastor and we have all of these programs, but the problem for me as a small groups pastor is I don't really have much say in those other programs. So what would your advice be to the small groups pastor that's trying to develop the on-ramp, but there's so many different things that are really outside of their control? Does that make sense?
No, yeah, absolutely.
It's a tough spot, I think.
It is. It's funny you talk about kind of the swing toward this direction. Back in the day, they were called MEs, Ministers of Education, and a lot of churches had that. That was a position. It was kind of Sunday school. And then, when they kind of shifted more to small groups, that position started disappearing. And then styles started changing. I read, it may have been Eric Geiger, somebody said the other day that in the 90s, pastors broke up with their discipleship pastors and ran away with their worship pastors. And so that became more of the, the budget and the direction, and it was all about the weekend and Sunday and all that. And I'm seeing some of that come back, and like you said, hiring more discipleship pastors. But yes, it is a struggle when you're on a staff and you're not getting the budget, and there's so many other ministries that are going on. And I would say to that small group point person or pastor that don't get discouraged. It's going to take some time. Continue building something that's fruitful, that's life-giving. And again, going back to that list, bring those to your definitely to your supervisor, but hopefully eventually to the lead pastor of, hey, this is what's happening. We have a small group that's seeing this happen, life change happening. The small group leader baptized somebody in their group a couple weeks ago. There was somebody that was in the hospital and they were there first. And just continue to kind of just seed those stories and look for those stories so you can kind of feed it up, and eventually it's going to get to the pastor. And again, it's going to take some time. But I don't know a single pastor that I've met that when they're seeing life change happening in a ministry, they're going to start promoting that ministry. That ministry is going to become important. And so I would just continue to do that, continue the communication. I talk to a lot of small group pastors and point people, and I ask them, when's the last time you had a one-on-one with your senior pastor? And they're like, it's been a couple of years, or, it doesn't happen that very often. You need to be connected to your senior leader. It doesn't have to be weekly, maybe not even monthly, but at least maybe once a quarter. Set aside a few minutes and just connect with the heart of your leader and let them know what's going on in your ministry. If they don't know, they're not going to know to put fire on it. Sometimes it feels like we're asked to build, more bricks with less straw, like in Exodus. So kind of bring that to your senior pastor. Continue to share the good news of what's happening in groups.
Very good, very good. Well, and that goes to my next question. You say more bricks, less straw. So the other problem, I think, in reason number 4, you talked about. Well, here's my question. In the smaller the church, when they hire a staff person, sometimes you're not the full-time small groups person. Small group, but it's always thrown in somewhere, right? There's always, even in small church, even a church of 100 or 200 people, if you're an associate pastor, somebody has the small groups role. But you might have the small groups role and the connections role and the discipleship role and over everything else. So what would your advice be to somebody that because in reason number 4, you said you have to have somebody that's constantly thinking about groups.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, it's easy to say that, but when you've got groups and everything else on your job description, what would your advice be to somebody that groups is a small part, but they know that it's going to take more than what they're being paid for or compensated for, or what they have time for?
Right. And I totally understand that. I mean, I've been an associate pastor of a smaller church, and you're doing it all, at least at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I planted a church. And when I planted my church, I was, cleaning the floors on Sunday morning. I was, making sure the offering was counted. So there are things that you need to do. And if you're in that position, start looking for volunteers, key volunteers that can come alongside you, that believe in small groups, in discipleship, and that can become kind of your leadership team with your groups. We don't want to do anything in a vacuum when it comes to church and to leadership. And so start building kind of those 2 or 3 people that come to meetings. You may have to do those meetings in the evening when they have the time, or doing over Zoom or something like that, but bring them in on those key decisions, those times that you need to just talk about groups and talk about discipleship, and just start building that. That becomes your pipeline. So eventually you want a leadership pipeline. So you're not doing it all. You don't want to do it all. And this begins that process in having those people, the leadership team, and it builds another opportunity for volunteers, all of that. So even though it may be right now a subset of your job description, it doesn't mean that you can't build a team around it, and you can't have other people with some time to help you out with groups. So don't go it alone. There are volunteers that want to do it with you. Just ask them, bring them on board, build your leadership team.
Gotcha. That's great advice. Probably if you're in that situation and you're trying to do it yourself, you're probably really setting yourself up for failure.
Oh, you are. You're stealing ministry is what you're doing. Yeah. I mean, because there are people who are gifted for this, who have a passion for this, and if you're trying to do it, you're taking that away from them. So yeah. Very good.
Love it. One last question. This is maybe a little different. Maybe I saw a squirrel over here, but I want to talk about it here quick. Because I've seen this happen, and maybe this has to do with you talked about the different types of groups and the purpose of groups, and might be a little different for each church. But I know that I've seen in our church, our local church, that small groups sometimes are kind of now becoming the on-ramp, so that people will come to a small group before they'll ever come to a weekend service. Maybe they don't want to step foot in a church, but they'll go to somebody's house and do a small group because they have friends that invite them. Are you seeing any? Is this like a trend or something that's kind of happening more than it did a while? Because I don't remember, 10 years ago, small groups were always something that were kind of birthed inside the church and were kind of totally internal. And now it seems like it's maybe the on-ramp for a lot of people to get their first taste of Jesus.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing that trend, and I'm a big believer in it. That small groups, a lot of times we think of small groups as kind of closing the back door. So when people come to the church, they get plugged into a community, and they're less likely to kind of slip out the back door. And I absolutely believe in that. But I think we forget a lot of times that they can be the front door, that it can be evangelism. And I think it's a great place to start for a lot of people. I can invite my neighbor easier over to my house for dinner with some friends in our group than I can on a Sunday morning, to a church when they've never been to a church or haven't been to a church in years. But you can start with a relationship. So I think that's a great way to look at groups. I think a big kind of shift in that was back with the missional movement, when that became a big deal. And so missional communities became a thing, and that was a healthy thing, looking at your neighborhood and the people around you to be a part of your community and your group, and not just bringing them to church. So I think the missional movement really was a good movement toward looking outside, not just inside, when it comes to groups. Gotcha.
Very good, man. There's just so much great information there. What would be some next steps, Chris? I assume your book would be a great next step. It kind of, you've outlined a lot of the things in your book. So definitely you can get that at Amazon or your local Christian bookstore. It's called, what's it called?
Small
Again,
groups for
Chris?
the rest of us.
Small groups for the rest of us. Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. So but you can pick up a copy of that, but maybe there's some churches that I know you do some consulting and some things with your work there at Lifeway. How would be a good one to get a hold of you or to connect with you and maybe talk a little bit more if they're really serious about, we really need to make some progress in this area?
Sure, I'd love to. I do a lot of consulting. A few ways you can get a hold of me. One is my website. It's chrissurratt.com. And I write a lot about groups on there, and there's a contact that you can reach out to me that way.
Great.
Or if you want to email me, my email is chris.surratt@lifeway.com. So you can definitely do that. Or social media, pretty much everything at Chris Surratt. It's a great thing about having a name nobody else has is you can own it in every space. So yeah, you can reach out to me that way. And like I said, I host things like Small Group Essentials, which are 2 days. They're free. And they're by invite only. We keep them to about 20 to 25 small group pastors, point people, and we just talk about groups for 2 days. So do a lot of that. Also, I host a podcast called Group Answers, which is a weekly podcast where we talk about these issues. So yeah, a lot of ways you can connect, but I'd love to talk to you if I can help.
Great. Well, thanks so much again, Chris. I really appreciate you sharing with us. And, I don't know of any church anywhere that doesn't, I imagine there are some, but that doesn't at least feel like they need to do better at small groups. Some are hitting it out of the park, but a lot just really need some help and assistance and guidance. So I hope that this has been helpful. I'm sure it has been. And thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Todd. It was great.
Great. And as we close, if you've got any questions for next week's office hours, please go ahead and send those to us at labs@leadnet.org. Again, thanks for joining us. Thanks again, Chris. We'll catch you soon.
Yep.